For what we do, our actions speak for themselves. Thank you.
He literally came from nowhere and created a dynasty. He was a charismatic man, a powerful man, a tell it like it was in your face type guy.
The union came first, his family came second. He didn't have any distractions and outside interest.
He had this tremendous energy. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't chase girls. All he wanted to do was work.
I had more fun here working than anybody can have on a golf course or any sport you can name.
He was a devoted father as well as much appreciated husband. On the other hand, he was egotistical. I think he was power hungry. There's no question the guy was a criminal.
Hoffa did a tremendous disservice to truckers across America. Let's face it, he was corrupt.
My ethics, very simple. Live and let live, and those who try to destroy you, make it your business to see that they don't and that they have problems.
Hey, thanks for coming. We can't do it without you guys. Thanks.
James P. Hoffa was elected president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in December 1998.
Permanent trade status. Let's go to the Hill and let's give hell. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go.
He vowed to restore the Union to the glory days it enjoyed under his father, Jimmy. The union that Jimmy Hoffa built was once the biggest and most powerful in America. It was also the most corrupt. The power of the Teamsters, as well as their near self-destruction, are the crux of Jimmy Hoffa's deeply divided legacy. James Riddle Hoffa was born on Valentine's Day, 1913, in the poor mining town of Brazil, Indiana, 60 miles west of Indianapolis. He was the third of 4 children born to a Pennsylvania Dutch coal miner and an Irish immigrant mother.
He had a loving father and respected his father a lot, and so he had quite a secure home life. They were in the lower class. They didn't have much, so they learned early in life that they had to work and work hard.
When Jimmy was 7 years old, his father, John, died of black lung from working in the mines. The boy was old enough to understand that his father had been literally worked to death. Jimmy's mother, Viola, resolved to keep the family going. She managed to get by doing laundry for other families in town. Jimmy and his older brother Billy inherited their mother's determination and her hard edge. They shined shoes and delivered the clothes their mother washed.
Dad told me a story one time about some little ruffians that came and roughed the boys up and caused the laundry to be dumped out of the basket and get dirty, so their mother would have to do it all over again. And they took care of these boys in proper order.
He was always self-conscious about how he looked. He was short. His size gave him a complex, and I think he had to fight a little harder and show more muscle.
Viola Hoffa packed up her family in 1924 and moved from Indiana to Detroit, where there were more job opportunities. She started working in a laundry and at an auto parts factory polishing radiator caps. Young Jimmy had a hard time adjusting to city life, and the kids in the neighborhood called him a hillbilly.
It took him a while in Michigan to let the kids understand that he wasn't going to put up with a lot of their teasing, that they called him names and so forth.
The Hoffa family struggled, even with Viola's 2 jobs, so 12-year-old Jimmy got a weekend job bagging potatoes at a grocery store. He quickly worked his way up to delivery boy. 2 years later, Jimmy dropped out of the 9th grade to work full-time.
The family needed money, and they didn't need him in school, so he had to sacrifice his education. He had to go to work. He got a job where he could, make some small amount of money.
Not long after the stock market crashed in the fall of 1929, 16-year-old Hoffa got a job unloading produce for the Kroger Grocery Company. The men were only paid for the time they spent unloading goods. The rest of the day, they waited for the next delivery.
All the workers were in a kind of a depressed group. They didn't have no money. They were all broke, and they really didn't have nothing.
They had no protection on the job and very, very low wages. And so they decided to organize themselves into a local union.
With the country falling into the grip of the Great Depression, most of the men were cautious. But not Hoffa. He had seen how hard his father worked only to die young, with no benefits or security for his family. Hoffa called for a work stoppage one night in May 1931, just as the men were unloading trucks filled with fresh strawberries.
We unloaded half the car and got it wide open, so it lost all its refrigeration, and then refused to unload the rest of it. Everybody got excited.
The men, inspired by Hoffa, decided they would not unload these strawberries unless management signed a union contract with them.
Kroger management agreed to meet with Hoffa the following morning, as long as the workers resumed their duties. After several days of negotiating, Jimmy and his aides won a contract for the workers, their first ever. Hoffa was thrilled. He had found his calling.
Even at that early age, he obviously was a very charismatic person. He was 17, 18 years old. He's out there saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have this strike.
Union leaders were impressed with the young man. So 1 year later, 19-year-old Hoffa landed a job as a full-time organizer for Teamsters Joint Council 43 in Detroit. Jimmy immediately took to the rough-and-tumble world of union politics, despite the dangers. Companies often hired mobsters to intimidate workers and disrupt picket lines with brute force. Hoffa found a solution. He forged his own relationship with the underworld.
He came to the realization that he needed muscle. And so he made a deal with the Mafia. And so, actually what he wanted them to do really was to just stay out of those strikes and just sit on the sidelines and not fight them.
He forged alliances with mobsters in Cleveland, Chicago, New York, northern New Jersey, and in other places, feeling that that was just recognizing reality.
At age 22, Jimmy was appointed business agent of Teamsters Local 299 in Detroit. It was a run-down, debt-ridden unit with only 250 members. Union officials hoped that the energetic Hoffa could breathe new life into the group. Young Jimmy relished the challenge.
In negotiations, he had a saying. He said to me, Bob, he said, you know, when we go into negotiations, don't get up and leave. Let the bastards get tired, and then we can whip them.
A group of female laundry workers approached Hoffa in March 1936 and asked him for advice in organizing a strike. Jimmy could not help noticing one of the women, a 17-year-old Polish beauty named Josephine Poziewak. He would later write of that moment, "I felt like I'd been hit on the chest with a blackjack." The couple had a brief courtship and were married that fall by a justice of the peace. Not everyone was happy about the marriage, especially Jimmy's mother.
She was a rather stern person. My memories of her, she was a little scary. She did not approve of the marriage of my mother and my father, and I would think probably that my mother's family didn't approve either. They thought of him as a hillbilly, and the other side thought of her as a Polak.
Their family's disapproval only served to make the couple closer, and it lasted.
My parents were kind of opposites. My dad neither drank nor smoked in his whole life. My mother loved a good time. She liked a cocktail. She loved to have parties. He wasn't real fond of parties. He called her the sergeant because she was the only one that could boss him around. And she would tell him when he'd come home, well, this is what needs to be done, and would, tell him different chores that needed to be done, and he would always do them very cheerfully.
But young Hoffa was happiest on the job, fighting battles for the Union and rising through its ranks. At the age of 24, he was elected president of Local 299. Under his strong, hands-on leadership, membership soared from 250 to 4,000. Most were truckers and warehouse workers. To them, Jimmy was just one of the guys.
The name is Hoffa. Hi, I'm Jimmy. I know you. Stuff like that. He'd call some of them by name. made tremendous impression.
Even though he was president of the local, Hoffa would never ask his men to do something he wouldn't do himself. The hot-tempered Jimmy worked the picket lines and was always willing to take on anyone who stood in his way.
My mother always told the story about when he would come home all full of blood, and she would clean the blood up, put a clean shirt on him, patch him up, and say, "You shouldn't go back," and then off he would go back. And then come back again with the other side of his head open.
When he wasn't fighting for the Union, Jimmy was dedicated to his young wife. He took pride in the purchase of their first house in Detroit. In 1938, Josephine gave birth to a girl, Barbara. 3 years later came a son, who they called Little Jim.
It was a special time when he was home because he wasn't the 9-to-5 dad. As busy as he would try and find time for us to, to take us fishing or hunting or to be with us in a special way.
He was a father whom they both adored and often said there was like walking down the street with some god, because he was so often mobbed in Detroit by well-wishers, and they were enormously proud of that.
The Hoffas bought a hunting lodge near the Iron River in northern Michigan in 1939. Jimmy would often take his Union cohorts up to the lodge to relax. It gave him an opportunity both to work and be with his family.
When we would go up deer hunting, we'd bring our boys with us. They'd take off with Hoffa, and he'd trip them through the woods and teach them what he knew about nature.
He was not a college professor, didn't profess to be educated beyond what he was. But the amazing thing is that he was so intelligent.
Over time, Hoffa would use that intelligence not only to drive hard bargains for the truck drivers who made up the bulk of the Teamsters, he would also craft a deal with the devil. Using his long-standing Mafia connections, he would rise to the very top of the Union. Those connections would haunt him for the rest of his life.
I don't intend to have the impression left, as been stated publicly, that I'm controlled by gangsters. I am not controlled by them.
During World War II, while Americans were fighting overseas, young Jimmy Hoffa was traveling across the country, fighting his way to the top of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Hoffa was 28 years old when the war began, but was not called to serve because his union work with the trucking industry was considered essential to the war effort. Throughout the 1940s and early 50s, the mine worker's son was driven by memories of his own family's poverty.
My dad had memories of the Depression, and we grew up with that legacy, so that as we prospered and as things got better, he never let us forget. And sometimes he would say to us at a particularly wonderful moment when we were all so happy and we had everything we wanted, he would say, "I wonder what the poor people are doing." And that was a way of telling us, be sure you appreciate what you've got.
But Hoffa's steady rise to power had a dark side. He had never broken his early ties to the Mafia. The mob controlled Union locals around the country and used that power to push their man Hoffa to the top. Jimmy was elected Union Vice President in 1952. As part of his new responsibilities, he controlled the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund based in Chicago. With millions of dollars at his fingertips, Hoffa found a way to pay back his friends in the mob.
His deal with the mob was that they would help him stay in power if he would let them use the pension funds as a bank and make investments as they wanted to. Hoffa was a smart guy. He knew what he was doing, and they knew what they were doing.
Many of the pension fund loans went to mob frontmen for the construction of hotels and casinos in Las Vegas.
Jimmy had the foresight to see that those were good loans and how Vegas was going to grow. And he was, in my judgment, largely responsible for Vegas being what it is today. But let's not lose sight of the fact that those loans were made to mobsters, and that was muscle that he could use. There was invariably a kickback in the form of cash or a hidden interest.
Then Hoffa ran smack into someone who was just as tough and tireless as he was, but who came from the other side of the tracks, Robert F. Kennedy. These two men could fight a class war all by themselves.
Both men, the Ivy League aristocrat, Bobby Kennedy, and Jimmy Hoffa, really did have a lot in common. Both were feisty, both have been described as ruthless, both generated enormous loyalty and enormous hatreds, and I think there really was a chemical reaction between the two of them.
At the time, Bobby Kennedy was chief counsel for a U.S. Senate committee investigating union corruption. Hoffa first appeared before the committee in August 1957.
Did you say that SOB, I'll break his back?
They give his speech. I don't even know who I was talking about, and I don't know what you're talking about.
Bobby Kennedy and his brother Senator John Kennedy, who served on the committee, charged that the Teamsters were controlled by the mob. The tension between Chief Counsel Kennedy and Teamster boss Hoffa was apparent from the start.
I don't intend to have the impression left, as been stated publicly, that I'm controlled by gangsters. I am not controlled by them.
I say you're not tough enough to get rid of these people, then.
Well, I don't propose to
You haven't
be
moved
tough.
against any of them.
I don't propose to act tough, and I will follow the Constitution of the International Union.
Hoffa was convinced that Bobby Kennedy wanted to destroy him because he couldn't control him.
He had very little respect for Bobby, and that was a tremendous clash of personalities, and most people rolled over for the Kennedys, and my father wouldn't.
In my opinion, he is never in his life ran up against a situation he couldn't dominate, that he couldn't control, and have his way. He's just a spoiled young millionaire that never had to go out and find a way to live by his own efforts.
Hoffa's temper flared when Bobby Kennedy questioned him about the rumored communist ties of other prominent union leaders.
Would you allow, as a Teamster official, a man who was a communist, who was elected by the membership?
We don't have any communists in our Teamsters. Just a moment, please, that I know of.
What do you mean? There's no question about Mr. Goldblatt, although there can be a question about Mr. Hoffa. There's no question about Mr. Goldblatt.
Oh, wait a minute, just
He
a moment.
wasn't
Don't say
allowed
anything
into
about a
England
question about Hoffa. There is no question about Hoffa, and don't you say that either. Don't you say that I'm a communist, or even affiliated with one. You said that enough around this country, and I want the American press to know that I resent the fact that there is any inference that I'm a communist.
Of course, their relationship developed beautifully. They hated each other to their dying day.
There's only one thing I like about Bobby Kennedy.
What's that?
His willingness to work and to fight to win. Now, outside of that, I don't have any use for him.
Jimmy was furious that his family had to be subjected to the negative publicity swirling around him.
He would always tell us if he knew ahead, if a story was going to be in the paper. He would always let us ask any questions we wanted to ask and make us a part of it so that we understood what was going on.
The biggest surprise, I think, that the family had was when they heard a lot of profanity being attributed to Hoffa in quotations, which in fact he was very capable of using it, but he never used it around the house.
Despite the allegations of corruption, the union's rank and file stood by Hoffa. In October 1957, he was elected General President of the Teamsters by an overwhelming 72% of the vote.
They chant Jimmy, 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 and jubilant Jimmy Hoffa sweeps in as new president of the Teamsters.
After the election, Hoffa moved to Washington, D.C. and away from his family. His wife stayed at home in Detroit while their son finished high school.
He never spent as much time as he wanted to with them. And his wife, he missed her real well. It was rough on him. He gave up more than anybody would be expected to do. He did really give it up.
He didn't show his emotions very easily, but you never, 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 as his child, ever felt that he didn't completely love you. He'd be so happy to get home, and he'd be tired, and he'd sit in the big chair, and one of my special things was I would untie his shoes and take his shoes off for him.
Being away from his family gave Jimmy even more time to focus on the Teamsters. He was determined to make the union the most powerful in America, and he did it by making himself accessible to his membership.
He would give out his personal phone numbers in Washington, D.C., and he would say, anytime you have a problem, just call me. I don't care what time, day or night it is. Call me, and I'll be at the other end of the phone.
Jim, if you don't smoke and you don't drink, and you don't play around the golf, what do you do for entertainment?
Right here, work.
This is entertainment?
7 days a week I have more fun here working than anybody can have on a golf course or any sport you can name. Every minute here is something new, something keeps you alert, because you're competing with the best brains in the United States.
But Hoffa's troubles were far from over. The Kennedys would soon control the White House, and putting the union boss behind bars would be high on their agenda.
I'm not satisfied when I see men like Jimmy Hoffa, in charge of the largest union in the United States, still free.
The committee, with Robert F. Kennedy as counsel, accused Hoffa's Teamsters Union of being riddled with racketeers and hoodlums.
By the late 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa's name was becoming synonymous in the public eye with mob corruption. He was the target of a government probe that threatened to strip him of his power and land him in prison. The Kennedys were publicly attacking him every chance they had. In 1960, his name even came up during the presidential debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy.
I'm not satisfied when I see men like Jimmy Hoffa, in charge of the largest union in the United States, still free.
Hoffa wasn't about to let Senator Kennedy have the last word.
Certainly it is a disgrace to the millions of Americans who heard that program to have a senator of the United States, that an American citizen should not be allowed to be free when there is no pending indictments, no trials, and no charges against that individual.
Hoffa tried not to let his battles with the Kennedys affect his personal life. He put his troubles on the back burner in October 1961 when his only daughter, Barbara, got married.
My mother told my father that she wanted me to have the wedding that she always wanted. And so I had a Polish wedding. We sent out 800 invitations and 2,000 people came.
The 48-year-old Hoffa wore a tuxedo for the first time in his life. It was also the first time he ever danced.
He was good. It was good. My mother was just rather upset because he would never dance with her, and she said, "How did you know what to do?" He says, "All you got to do is watch everybody and just, learn by looking at people."
By now, JFK was president and had appointed his brother Bobby as Attorney General. It was Hoffa's worst nightmare.
Jimmy would say to anybody who would listen, to the reporters or anybody else, "Look what money can buy. Look what power can buy. Bobby Kennedy is now the Attorney General. He has never tried a case in his life. How could that be?"
Jimmy's hatred for Bobby Kennedy intensified when he learned that the Attorney General's first order of business was to form a new unit in the Justice Department known as the Get Hoffa Squad.
There were some 15 grand juries across the country investigating him simultaneously. He knew there was just a matter of time that sooner or later Bobby was going to get him.
One day, Hoffa and his attorney, Frank Regano, went to Kennedy's office to review court documents.
Jimmy is a very impatient man, very punctual, always very punctual. Meetings I had with him, he was always 10 or 15 minutes early and never late.
Kennedy kept Hoffa waiting for 45 minutes. Jimmy was furious.
Jimmy didn't call Bobby Kennedy Bobby, he called him Booby. And so finally Booby shows up and he's got a dog on a leash. And Jimmy just absolutely attacks him, grabs him by his throat and slams him against the wall. Says, "You son of a, you keep me waiting over here while you're walking your dog." And he had his hands firmly around Booby's throat.
Kennedy left the room without a word and never pressed charges.
I'm not unaware of the fact that a lot of people disagree probably with my actions, my ethics, but my ethics is very simple. Live and let live, and those who try to destroy you, make it your business to see that they don't and that they have problems.
But it was Hoffa who was starting to have problems. He was indicted in May 1962 on charges of accepting illegal payments from a trucking company. The trial was in Nashville. When the jury couldn't reach a decision, the judge declared a mistrial. He was indicted again the following year, this time on charges of jury tampering in the Nashville case.
It is a continuation of the vendetta of Bob Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States, against myself and the Teamsters Union, in my opinion.
Hoffa was on the road that November 22nd when he learned the news that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. Days later at Teamsters headquarters, one of Hoffa's aides had lowered the flag to half-staff. When Jimmy saw the show of respect for Kennedy, he threw one of his trademark temper tantrums, fired his assistant, and raised the flag himself.
When John Kennedy was assassinated, Hoffa was happy about it. He had gotten rid of one of his biggest enemies.
Jimmy hoped that Bobby Kennedy would now resign as Attorney General, but RFK wanted to see the jury tampering case through.
We've got to get this guy. That's what Robert Kennedy told him. He was very interested in continuing this thing and making sure that the trial took place and that Hoffa would go in prison.
The headstrong labor leader was undeterred. On January 16, 1964, Hoffa signed a landmark collective bargaining contract, the National Master Freight Agreement. It doubled and in some cases tripled Teamsters' wages across the country and guaranteed health benefits.
His vision was that we would have the same wages and hours and working conditions from coast to coast to standardize the competition. It was a crowning achievement for him.
Just 4 days after signing the contract, the jury tampering case began in Chattanooga. Jimmy's power couldn't help him this time. He was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Hoffa then went on trial in Chicago to face fraud charges in connection with Teamster pension fund loans. He was again found guilty.
I think the lawyers were assuring him that they would be able to prevent him from having to go to prison. And I think that up until the last he hoped to believe them, but maybe in his heart of hearts he always was a realist.
While waiting for word on his appeals, Hoffa was re-elected president of the Teamsters in July 1966. He pushed through an amendment to the Teamsters Constitution, allowing him to remain in office behind bars. Even after his appeals were denied, he insisted that he had done nothing wrong.
I stand here today before you as I stood in front of that court and took an oath that I was not then guilty, nor am I guilty now.
Hoffa put up a strong front for his men, but inside he was falling apart.
That Friday before Hoffa was to surrender, which was Tuesday, he called me and said, "Joe, I have to talk to you." And Jimmy became hysterical, and he started shouting at me, "I'm not going. I'm not going. Joe, I'm not going."
On the morning he had to leave, just as he did every morning, my daughter would walk him to the elevator. And he had tears in his eyes, and as she said every time when he'd get into the elevator, she said, "See you later." And he didn't say anything, and off he went.
On March 7, 1967, the 54-year-old Hoffa surrendered to U.S. Marshals in Washington, D.C. He was sent to federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, to begin serving a combined 13-year sentence, 8 for jury tampering and 5 for fraud. Jimmy had faith that he would be out of jail soon enough, but he didn't count on being betrayed by one of his own.
Outside the district court building in the nation's capital, Teamster boss James Hoffa surrenders to U.S. Marshals to begin serving an 8-year prison term for jury tampering.
Teamsters President Jimmy Hoffa began serving his prison term in 1967. He now lived in a 7 by 10-foot jail cell in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. For a powerful man who was always on the move, it was the worst punishment imaginable.
He was confined to a cage. People from the Bureau of Prisons would come by like he was an animal at the zoo, and they would point at him and snicker and laugh.
He had a terrible time there. The worst times for Jimmy were the family visits. And when I saw him at that time, he was very beaten down, very depressed, very thin. He looked awful.
To lift his spirits on his 55th birthday, union workers hired a plane to fly over the prison, pulling a banner. Hoffa was confident the Teamsters looked forward to his release. He was still president of the most powerful union in America, and he was sure that his hand-picked proxy, Frank Fitzsimmons, was working to get him out.
I think he picked Fitzsimmons because I think that he believed that Fitz was above reproach. Fitz was Irish, non-controversial, a Catholic. They don't do no wrong. And if they do, they can confess and it's all straightened out.
What Hoffa didn't realize was that his old friend Fitzsimmons was scheming to oust him and take his place as Teamster president. Nor did Hoffa know that, in his absence, Fitz was letting the mob have its way with the Teamsters pension fund.
Jimmy Hoffa could say no to the mob on a loan, whereas Fitzsimmons did not have the courage or the nerve to do so. So they were a lot more comfortable with Fitzsimmons. They didn't want Jimmy back.
At Lewisburg, most of the inmates and guards respected Hoffa and would often ask for his advice. Jimmy would gladly give it.
He became the unofficial business agent for the guards. The guards would come to him with their problems. Jimmy would tell them what they should do, how they should speak, what they should say. He was reprimanded a couple of times by the warden, but that didn't stop Hoffa.
Of course, typical of my father, he became a leader there for the prisoners' rights and a liaison to the warden about the complaints that the prisoners would have.
Please stay back!
Hoffa received word in June 1968 that his old nemesis, Robert Kennedy, had been assassinated in Los Angeles. He was relieved when he heard the news. After all, Hoffa blamed the Kennedys for putting him behind bars.
Hoffa could not bring himself to say in any way that he was sorry. He held Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy responsible for the many legal problems that he had been beset by.
Being separated from his family was unbearable for Jimmy, but being away from the Teamsters was even more difficult. For 4 years he ran the union from prison. Then in 1971, his lawyers told him that he would not be released as long as he was still affiliated with the Teamsters. So Hoffa reluctantly turned the presidency over to Fitzsimmons, assuming it would be a temporary. As a result, 2 days before Christmas, President Nixon commuted his sentence and allowed a much grayer and more subdued Hoffa to leave Lewisburg.
Jimmy! Come on, Jimmy! Let's go, Jake. Take care.
I never saw anybody with a bigger smile. If his face was any wider, his smile couldn't even fit on his face. He was so happy. My mother, of course, was in a terrible emotional state.
For months, Jimmy had looked forward to seeing his granddaughter and meeting his 2 grandsons who were born while he was in prison. He was also eager to regain his old position of power as soon as possible.
He was very vocal critic about the way the union was being run, and said, when I get in there, I'm going to change it all. He was on a mission to come back.
Anybody who wouldn't want to be the head of the Teamsters Union would be a fool or an idiot.
But unbeknownst to Hoffa, President Nixon had added a clause to the commutation that would bar Jimmy from running for Teamster president until 1980, 9 years away. Hoffa was stunned. He was convinced it was Fitzsimmons' doing.
Jimmy really felt betrayed by Frank Fitzsimmons. He said, I took him off a truck, bought him his first suit, made him president of the union. And he betrayed me. He was really hurt.
Jimmy's time in prison had taught him a valuable lesson. He had always believed that the mob was essential to both the union and his personal power. Now he seemed to realize the Mafia was a stone around the Teamsters and his own neck.
He said, tell the rats to get off the ship because I'm coming back. And he would do anything to get that power back.
He was really beginning to lose it. He was so obsessed with regaining the presidency of the union that he was not acting rational.
It was a dangerous move to turn away from the source of so much of his power, but Hoffa was determined to see it through. He filed a lawsuit to win back the right to run for union president.
Say to him, Jimmy, please stop trying to get back. These guys are too powerful. You don't need the money. You've got a good pension. You can take care of the family, as you always have. No, I can't live like that, Joe. I can't live like that. And that went on day after day after day.
I was worried about his safety. I was concerned about that people wouldn't want my father to come back. People on the executive board wouldn't want him to come back. My father was fearless.
He was a guy who had no bodyguards. There was no security around his house. I think his ego was so big at times that it was like nobody can hurt me. And I think he got careless.
On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy left his home in Lake Orion, Michigan. He told his wife Jo he was heading to a nearby restaurant for a 2 o'clock meeting. Jimmy called Jo at 2:30 that afternoon to say his associates had not shown up. He told her that he'd be home at 4 to grill steaks for dinner. That would be the last time Josephine Hoffa would talk to her husband. On a hot summer day in 1975, 62-year-old Jimmy Hoffa left his house in Lake Orion, Michigan for a meeting at a restaurant. He never returned.
My mother called at 7:30, and when she said the fateful words, "Your father didn't come home last night," I knew that something terrible had happened, because that was so unlike him.
Police found Hoffa's unlocked car in the parking lot of the restaurant. It offered no clues.
My father, James R. Hoffa, has been missing for some 32 hours. He left for an appointment at Max's Red Fox restaurant at approximately 1:30 p.m. Wednesday, July 30, 1975. He called home at approximately 2:15 p.m. We have not heard from him since.
The Hoffa family offered a $200,000 reward for any information about Jimmy's disappearance.
It looked like a kidnapping because we started receiving all of these calls saying that they were holding Hoffa hostage because of the national publicity that came out of the disappearance. So the FBI became involved, and they really did a credible job of trying to solve the disappearance.
The two men Hoffa was supposed to meet, Tony Giacalone and Tony Provenzano, both had alibis and denied a meeting was even supposed to take place. But there was no denying that Hoffa was at the restaurant and was picked up by someone. Some believe that the mobsters used one-time Hoffa friend Chucky O'Brien to set up the labor leader.
People have told me that they think that Dad wouldn't have gotten in any car except if someone that he knew and trusted was in the car, and so they surmised that maybe Chucky was in the car.
Chucky O'Brien and his widowed mother had lived with the Hoffa family while Chucky was growing up, but the relationship soured after O'Brien sided with Frank Fitzsimmons in order to keep his job as a Teamsters organizer.
During the interviews with Chucky O'Brien, he gave conflicting stories. The stories that he gave and his alibis were inconsistent with what we know took place that day from witnesses and other people that were associated with O'Brien, which would tend to lead one to believe he was involved in the whole operation.
I know I had nothing to do with it. Never in my life would I ever want that to happen, and if I could have stopped it, if I had knowledge of it, I would have been there in a heartbeat.
O'Brien admitted to the FBI that on the day Hoffa disappeared, July 30th, 1975, he was driving a car owned by the son of Tony Giacalone. The FBI impounded the car and checked for evidence. Trained dogs placed Hoffa's scent in the back seat of the car and the trunk. The FBI crime lab also found a hair matching Hoffa's in the upholstery, as well as indications of skin and blood.
It's still in possession of the FBI, and there is, at the current time right now, DNA testing being done to try and further identify the evidence which was recovered out of that vehicle to see if we can more conclusively state that it came from Hoffa.
Let me tell you something. Mr. Hoffa was never in that car, and I'll tell the world that. I don't care what the FBI says. He never stepped foot in that car. Never.
On September 2nd, 1975, a federal grand jury investigating the disappearance heard from the first of 70 witnesses, including Giacalone, Provenzano, and Chucky O'Brien.
It became a circus, and these people all took the Fifth Amendment, and they brought everybody in who was involved, and really nothing came of it.
I was subpoenaed to appear before the grand jury in Detroit. When I was going up there, one of the mobsters who was involved was coming down the stairs, gave me a high sign. Take 5 or your throat's cut. So I went before the grand jury. I didn't take 5, and nothing came of that.
The FBI spent months searching for Hoffa. 29 acres in Pontiac, Michigan were dug up in the hope of finding his remains. Searches in the Florida Everglades and a mob-owned New Jersey dump site also came up empty. To this day, rumors abound as to the actual whereabouts of Jimmy Hoffa's body.
We've had people give information indicating that he's buried under Giant Stadium. He was put into a drum and buried in Lake Erie. People have come forward and said that his body was literally ground up in a meat grinder. It was shipped off to the Mideast. Any number of theories as to what happened to the body. And quite frankly, there's no evidence to point to one theory over another.
My mother was never the same after my dad disappeared. I don't think she had a will to live, and she just had a broken heart and would never ever really recuperate. She had spell after spell of sickness and just kept deteriorating before our eyes.
In 1980, Hoffa's widow, Josephine, died at the age of 62. 7 years after his disappearance, Jimmy Hoffa was declared legally dead in 1982. The disappearance of James Riddle Hoffa remains an unsolved crime. One FBI agent in Detroit still works the case.
We are optimistic that the case will be solved. We're doing everything we can to solve it, and we'll continue to do so. A lot of the individuals that we believe may have been associated with the Hoffa disappearance are deceased.
I just don't think the case will ever be solved because of the people that I feel was part of this tragedy. I'm never going to tell anybody about it. Nobody's ever going to find out in my lifetime.
In 1995, on the 20th anniversary of my dad's disappearance, we planned a memorial service. We had never had any kind of a service or any kind of recognition of his death.
In the streets of Detroit and throughout the heartland of America, Jimmy Hoffa struggled to build the Teamsters Union. Through those struggles in the streets, on the picket lines, at the negotiating table, he rose like a rocket.
It was like a funeral, but I won't be satisfied till I know exactly what happened. I'm going to keep trying the rest of my life to try to get the answers.
In December 1998, Jimmy's son, James P. Hoffa, was elected president of the Teamsters. To this day, the Teamsters Union, associated for so long with mob corruption, only operates under the supervision of the federal courts. That is the twin legacy of Jimmy Hoffa, a visionary labor leader who abused the extraordinary power of his position.
The average Teamster benefited from the fact that there was a tough union in Jimmy Hoffa. The question is, how much more would they have benefited if there'd been an honest Jimmy Hoffa? And the answer is they would have benefited infinitely.
Well, he was a man that you're very proud to have as your father. He was a man that came from tremendous poverty, fought his way to the top through sheer power of personality. A person like that comes along, once every 50 years.
I'm most proud of what my dad did for the working man, always making sure that the worker has his fair share and is treated fairly. And I think that that is his legacy.
There's no question the guy was a criminal, although criminal seems like a low-level word to use for somebody who was as complex and I think interesting as Jimmy Hoffa.